His bride hid a heartbreaking secret beneath her wedding dress. When the Duke discovered the truth, it shattered him. There are some secrets that people carry not because they want to lie, but because they are terrified of the truth. This is one of those stories. And honestly, the more you hear about it, the more it will make you feel something deep inside, something you cannot easily put into words. This is the true story of a duke and his bride. A story about a wedding that looked perfect from the outside. Beautiful flowers, an enormous church, a groom standing tall at the altar in his ceremonial uniform, and a young woman walking toward him in a white dress so lovely that people in the pews actually held their breath. But under that dress, under all that silk and lace and carefully stitched beauty, Lady Isolde was hiding something, something that would eventually break the Duke of Ashford completely, and something that would also, in the most unexpected way, teach him what love actually is. Let us go back to the beginning, because to understand this story properly, you need to understand who these two people really were. The Duke, his name was Lord Edward Harlow, the 8th Duke of Ashford, was not the kind of man people found easy to talk to. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and had the posture of someone who had spent years in the military, which he had. He served in the army for nearly a decade before his older brother died unexpectedly, and Edward suddenly found himself heir to a dukedom he had never planned on inheriting. People who knew Edward said he was honorable. They also said he was cold, not cruel, never cruel, but the kind of person who kept everything inside. He spoke carefully, moved carefully, and seemed to think 3 times before saying even the simplest thing. There was not a lot of warmth in him that you could see easily. You had to look for it, and most people did not bother looking. He had been married before. His first wife, a gentle and quiet woman named Lady Constance, had died of a fever 2 years into their marriage. He had grieved her properly. He wore black for the required period, closed the estate to visitors, and then opened it again, and after that he simply went on. He did not speak of Constance much. People assumed he did not feel her loss deeply. Those people were wrong. Edward felt everything deeply. He just had no idea how to show it. By the time he was 38, his family, particularly his aunt, who was the sort of woman who considered herself personally responsible for the dignity of the aristocracy, had decided it was well past time for Edward to remarry. He needed an heir. He needed a proper household. And so arrangements began, quietly and efficiently, the way arrangements always did in those circles. Lady Isolde Cavendish was 24 years old. She was the daughter of an earl whose money had quietly disappeared over the course of a decade. Bad investments, a gambling problem that the family pretended did not exist, and one particularly catastrophic year when 3 of their properties burned down within 12 months of each other. By the time Isolde was old enough to understand what was happening, her family was living on appearance and very little else. But Isolde herself was, and everyone who met her said this, remarkable. Not just in the way she looked, though she was undeniably beautiful, with dark eyes and a way of holding herself that made people think she was always slightly calmer than the situation called for. She was remarkable in the way she spoke. She listened, really listened, when people talked to her. She noticed things, the way a servant was moving slowly because their knee was hurting, the way a guest at a dinner party was smiling too hard because they did not want anyone to know something was wrong. She had been educated carefully, read widely, and had, somewhere along the way, developed a dry sense of humor that she mostly kept to herself, only allowing it to surface in quiet moments when she trusted the people around her. Those people, the handful who actually knew her, adored her completely. When the match with the Duke of Ashford was proposed, Isolde's mother was relieved in the way that people are relieved when they have been holding their breath for a very long time. The Duke was wealthy, he was respectable, he was not unkind, and Isolde, well, Isolde agreed, not reluctantly, not with great enthusiasm, but with the kind of quiet acceptance that came from understanding her situation clearly. A good match, a secure future, perhaps, with time, something more. They met formally for the first time at a dinner arranged by Edward's aunt. Isolde arrived with her mother, sat across the long table from Edward, and spent most of the meal expecting him to be boring. He had that reputation. Serious, stiff, difficult to speak to. What she did not expect was the moment when the elderly gentleman to Edward's left made a very long speech about the correct way to hunt pheasant, and she watched Edward's face out of the corner of her eye, watched the faintest, most controlled expression of absolute suffering pass across his features before disappearing entirely, and realized that behind the composed exterior there was someone who was actually experiencing the dinner the same way she was. When the gentleman finally stopped talking and the table returned to normal conversation, Isolde looked directly at Edward for the first time that evening. He looked back, and then, just barely, just for a half-second, the corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile, exactly. Something quieter than a smile. An acknowledgement. She looked away. But something had shifted. Over the following weeks, they met several more times. Walks in the park with a chaperone 3 steps behind, a visit to a gallery, 2 more dinners. Edward was not a man who talked a great deal, but when he did say something, it was worth listening to. He had opinions, real ones, not just the recycled views of whatever he had last read in a newspaper. He disagreed with her once, rather firmly, about whether a particular building in the city should be preserved or torn down. She argued back. He was visibly startled that she argued back. And then, slowly, he engaged. That disagreement lasted 40 minutes and covered 3 separate topics. By the end of it, Isolde was more interested in Edward Harlow than she had been interested in anyone in a long time, and Edward, though he would not have used this word, was fascinated. The engagement was announced 6 weeks after that first dinner. It was accepted by their respective circles as a sensible arrangement between 2 respectable families. Nobody watching from the outside would have guessed that the lady in question had, very quietly and without intending to, begun to love the man she was engaged to. And nobody watching from the outside could have known that this love was going to make what came next so much more painful. It was a Tuesday in March, 4 months before the wedding, when Isolde's world changed. She had been tired for a while, tired in a way that sleep did not fix. There was a cough that had started sometime in winter and simply never left. Her appetite had changed. She was thinner. She told herself it was stress, the preparations for the wedding, the social obligations that came with being engaged to a duke. She told herself a lot of things, but her mother had noticed. And her mother, quietly and without telling Isolde, had written to Dr. Wren, their family physician, a man who had known Isolde since she was born, and asked him to come and see her. Dr. Wren came on a Tuesday. He was a careful, quiet man in his late 50s with kind eyes and very steady hands. He examined Isolde in the sitting room while her mother waited in the hallway. He asked her questions. He listened to her breathe. He looked at things he did not comment on in the moment, which is always the thing that makes you most afraid. Then he sat down across from her and told her the truth. The illness had a long name that Isolde did not fully absorb the first time he said it. What she absorbed was the rest of what he told her. That it was serious, that it had already progressed further than he would like, and that based on everything he could determine, she likely had between 12 and 18 months, perhaps slightly more, perhaps slightly less. There was no cure. There were things that might slow it, but there was no cure. Isolde sat very still after he finished speaking. Outside the window, a bird was doing something noisy in the garden. A cart was going past in the road. The world was continuing, entirely indifferent to the fact that everything inside that sitting room had just broken apart. She asked Dr. Wren 2 questions. The first was whether he was certain. He said he was. The second was whether she would be in pain. He was honest with her. There would be difficult periods, but he would do everything he could to manage it. She nodded. She thanked him. She asked him to send her mother in. And then, alone with her mother, she cried. Not for long. She was not someone who cried for long. But for those few minutes, she allowed herself to feel the full, terrible weight of what she had just been told. Her mother held her and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. What happened next is the part of this story that people, when they hear it, have very complicated feelings about. Isolde decided not to tell Edward. She thought about it carefully. She was always careful, about everything, and she came to a conclusion that, from where she was standing, made complete sense. If she told Edward the truth, he would call off the wedding. Not because he was a bad man, because he was a good one. He would not, in his honor and decency, agree to marry a woman who was dying. He would see it as taking advantage of her. He would release her from the engagement with great dignity and great kindness, and she would spend whatever time she had left without him. And she did not want that. She had not planned to love him, but she did, and the thought of losing the life she had just barely begun to imagine, the library at Ashford Estate, the debates over dinner, the small quiet moments that had started to feel like the truest things in her day, was more than she could bear. She told herself that she would give them both something real, even if it was shorter than it should be. She would be a good wife, she would not be a burden, and when the time came, she would face it without making it harder for him than it needed to be. Her mother argued with her. The argument was long and painful, and ended with her mother weeping in a way that Isolde found almost unbearable to watch. But in the end, her mother agreed to keep the secret, because her mother also knew that Isolde was right about one thing. Edward would have called off the wedding. He absolutely would have, Dr. Wren was told. He did not agree with the decision. He said so, plainly, the way doctors sometimes do when they believe it is important. But Isolde was an adult. It was her truth to keep or share, and in the end he respected her choice, even as it sat heavily on him. And so the wedding preparations continued. The church was booked, the flowers were chosen, white roses and something small and blue that Isolde had always loved. The dress was made. It was a beautiful dress. It was also made with a special corset underneath, one that concealed the extent to which her body had already begun to change, to become thinner in ways that would have been visible and would have raised questions she was not prepared to answer. Under her wedding dress, Isolde carried her secret, and she walked toward the altar as if it weighed nothing at all. The morning of the wedding was the kind of June morning that England occasionally produces, as if to prove it is capable of it. Warm, clear, with a light breeze that smelled of flowers and freshly cut grass. The church of St. Margaret's had been decorated the previous afternoon and looked extraordinary in the morning light that came through the tall windows. Isolde woke early. She sat at the window of her childhood bedroom for a while, just looking at the garden. She had grown up in this house, played in that garden, climbed the oak tree at the far end until she was 13, and her mother finally put her foot down about it. She let herself look at all of it for a long time, quietly, without rushing. Then she got up and began to get dressed. Her mother came in to help with the corset. They did not speak about what they both knew. Lady Marin's hands shook slightly as she fastened the clasps, and Isolde placed her hand briefly over her mother's and pressed it, just once, before letting go and standing straight again. Inside the lining of her left glove, Isolde had placed a small dried forget-me-not. It had come from the garden of the house she had grown up in. It was the kind of small, private thing that nobody would ever know about unless she told them. She never told anyone, but it was there, pressed flat against her wrist, every minute of that day. The church was full. Isolde had not expected the crowd, though she should have. Marrying a duke meant half of English society showing up to watch. She could feel them all looking at her as she came down the aisle on her father's arm, and she understood that what they were seeing was the dress, the flowers, the procession, the occasion. They were not seeing her. That was in a way easier. Edward was at the altar. He was in his ceremonial uniform, standing very straight, and when she reached the midpoint of the aisle and he finally turned to look at her, something happened in his face that she had never seen before. Not the stiffness, not the careful composure. Something underneath that, something that moved. She did not know what it was, at the time. Later, much later, he would tell her. He would tell her that in the moment he saw her walking toward him, he had thought, with a certainty that caught him completely off guard, "She is the most remarkable person I have ever stood next to." And he had not even been standing next to her yet. The ceremony proceeded, the vicar spoke, the vows were said. When it came to the words about "in sickness and in health," Edward said them clearly, firmly, with his eyes on her face. Isolde said them back. And in that moment, With those words, she felt something crack inside her, quietly, in a place where no one could see it. Dr. Wren, seated in the third row, looked at the floor. Lady Marin, seated in the front row, did not look at her daughter's face. She looked at Edward's, and what she saw there made her feel, for the first time since all of this began, genuinely afraid, not of what Isolde was hiding, but of what discovering it was eventually going to do to this man. The reception at Ashford Estate was magnificent. The house was larger than anything Isolde had grown up in. Wide stone hallways, high ceilings, windows that looked out over gardens that seemed to go on forever. There were perhaps 200 guests, a full orchestra, more food than anyone could eat, and champagne that kept reappearing every time you set your glass down. Isolde was extraordinary at it. That is the only word. She moved through 200 people with a grace and warmth that made every single person feel as though they had been the most important conversation of her evening. She remembered names. She asked questions that proved she had actually listened the last time someone had spoken to her. She laughed at the right things, said the kind thing, made the awkward moments disappear. Edward watched her from across the room for a while and did not quite know what to do with what he was feeling. He had spent his life being the competent one in every room, the accomplished one, the one who could hold a conversation on any subject and command any situation. And here was his wife, a word he was still getting used to, simply outpacing him at his own estate, in his own world, doing it more effortlessly than he had ever managed. He found that he was not threatened by it. He was, if he was being honest with himself, quietly awed. They danced twice. The first time was formal and correct, the right distance between them, both of them aware of 200 pairs of eyes watching. The second time was later in the evening, when some of the formality had dissolved, and something shifted. She was tired, he could tell. Her movements were just slightly less precise than they had been, and she was relying on his lead more than he suspected she was comfortable admitting. So he adjusted. He slowed down without making it obvious. He held her slightly more steadily. She noticed. She looked up at him briefly, and he looked back, and neither of them said anything. But something passed between them that was more honest than most of what had happened between them in the previous weeks of formal courtship. Near the end of the second dance, he said quietly, because the thought arrived and he was not quick enough to stop it, "You are not what I expected." She considered this for a moment. Then, "Neither are you." It was not a compliment, from either of them. It was better than a compliment. It was true. Alone for the first time, the two of them existed in the strange, slightly awkward space that all new marriages have to cross. The gap between what had been formal and arranged and what was now real and present, and just the two of them in a room. Edward was careful with her. He helped her with the outer layers of the dress, in the way that a person helps someone when they are thinking about what the other person needs rather than about themselves. He asked, very quietly, whether she was well. She said she was tired. It was not a lie. He accepted it without pushing. And then, instead of what either of them might have expected from this night, they sat by the window together. The garden was lit by a nearly full moon, silver and very still. They could hear the distant sound of the orchestra still playing for the remaining guests downstairs. They talked about small things, about a joke that had fallen flat at dinner that evening and why exactly it had fallen flat, about the head gardener, who had apparently been fighting with the cook for the past 3 years over a disputed rosebush, about a book Isolde had been reading and could not finish because the ending seemed wrong to her, and Edward's response that sometimes wrong endings were more honest than satisfying ones. It was the most ordinary conversation imaginable. It was also the most natural either of them had felt with each other since they had met. She fell asleep before the conversation ended. He noticed when her replies started coming slower, and he did not wake her. He sat for a while longer in the chair by the window, looking at the moonlit garden, and thought about what kind of life was beginning. He did not think it would be a bad one. He had not expected to think that. The first weeks at Ashford were a process of two very careful people learning how to share a life. They were polite, attentive, and both quietly on their best behavior in a way that was slightly exhausting. But small things accumulated. Isolde began leaving notes on Edward's desk. Not love letters, nothing so grand. Small observations. A note that said the housekeeper, Mrs. Thornley, was very upset about something and might need a word. A note that said she had discovered that the cook made an exceptional cold soup that Edward had apparently been eating hot this entire time out of politeness, and someone needed to stop this immediately. A note that quoted, without explanation, the most bewildering sentence she had encountered in that week's reading, and left it there for him to make of it what he would. He read every note twice before putting it down, sometimes 3 times. He began bringing her books from the library, not books he thought she ought to read, but books he thought she would find interesting based on things she had said. Sometimes he was exactly right. Once he was spectacularly wrong, and she told him so at dinner that evening, with enough specificity that it took him a minute to recover, and then he laughed. A real laugh, unguarded, the kind that he appeared slightly surprised to hear coming out of himself. She stored that laugh away carefully. The mornings were the hardest part. Isolde was worse in the mornings. She coughed. She moved slowly until she had been awake for an hour or so. She had explanations for all of it. The air from the lake, she said, was always damp, and she had never done well with damp air. This was in fact true. It was just not the whole truth. Edward noticed. He was a man who paid attention, even when he appeared to be doing something else entirely. He did not say anything. He arranged for the windows on her side of the bedroom to be sealed against the night air. He had the kitchen ensure that there was always something warm ready for her in the mornings before she came down. These were not dramatic gestures. They were quiet ones. But they were the kind of attention that, if you were Isolde, you felt in a way that was harder to bear than you expected, because she knew what she was hiding, and every time he did something kind, the weight of the secret got slightly heavier. 2 months into the marriage, Edward noticed that Isolde was eating less, not dramatically less, not in a way that would alarm a casual observer, but he was not a casual observer. He watched and he saw. He also noticed something else, a quality in her that he could not quite name. She would be fully present, entirely animated, and then sometimes he would catch her in a moment when she had not noticed he was watching, and there was something in her face then. Not sadness, not quite. More like someone who was looking at everything around them with an extra layer of attention, taking it in, storing it. The way people sometimes look at a place they know they are leaving. He told himself he was imagining it. He wrote to Dr. Wren, not demanding, just asking whether Isolde had seemed unwell during the engagement, whether there was anything he should know. Dr. Wren wrote back. He said Lady Isolde had always been somewhat delicate in constitution, and that the Duke should not worry unduly. The letter was carefully worded. Every sentence was technically true. Edward read it twice, and then he let it go. He was not someone who pushed where he was not invited, and he had told himself he was imagining it. He was not imagining it. The collapse happened on an afternoon in September, in the rose garden at the eastern edge of the estate. Isolde had gone out to cut some roses for the sitting room, something she liked to do herself rather than leave to the staff, because she had strong opinions about which roses went with which rooms. One of the younger housemaids, Hannah, had gone with her, carrying the basket. Hannah found her on the ground between 2 rose bushes. Isolde had not fainted. She was conscious when Hannah reached her, but her legs had simply given way, all at once, without warning. She was sitting on the damp earth in her morning dress, with her hand against one of the rose canes, trying to look as though this was not as serious as it was. Hannah ran for help. She ran, specifically, for the Duke. Edward reached the garden before anyone else. He found Isolde exactly where Hannah had left her, sitting on the ground, composed in a way that made his chest tighten because the composure was clearly costing her something. He crossed the garden quickly and kneeled in the gravel next to her, heedless of his trousers and his dignity, and the 2 other staff members who were now watching from the doorway. He asked her what had happened. She said the heat. She said she had stood up too quickly and the heat had caught her. It was very warm for September, she said. Very warm. He looked at her face. She looked back at him, steadily, and she was doing the thing she always did when she was keeping herself composed. Her chin was very slightly lifted. Her breathing was controlled and deliberate. He had learned to recognize that look. He had learned that when she wore that look, she was working very hard, He did not argue with the heat explanation. He simply put his arm around her and helped her up, carefully, and walked her back to the house. Once inside, he sat her down and called for tea, and stayed with her for the next hour, without any explanation to his steward about why his afternoon schedule was now empty. Later that evening, when she was resting, he sat in his study for a long time and did not read, did not write, did not do any of the things he was supposed to be doing. He sat and he thought, and something in him shifted from, "I am imagining it," to, "I am not imagining it, and I do not know what to do about that." 3 weeks after the incident in the garden, Edward did what the part of him that had stayed a practical man all his life eventually always did. He took action. He wrote to a specialist in London, a physician with a particular expertise that he had heard mentioned in connection with cases similar, in some of their details, to the things he had been quietly observing. The letter was carefully worded, discreet. He said his wife had been experiencing some difficulties. He asked for a consultation. He did not tell Isolde he had written it. Dr. Wren knew someone who worked in the London postal system, a small, unglamorous fact that had occasionally proved useful in his career. He became aware of the letter before it reached London. He went to Isolde that same evening. She was in the library. She was reading, or pretending to read. He suspected the latter when he came in, and she did not look up immediately the way she usually did. She heard his voice, put the book down, and looked at him, and she saw from his face what had happened. She said, "How long?" He said, "The letter goes tomorrow." "I came tonight." She sat quietly for a moment. Then she asked for 1 week. She wanted to tell Edward herself. She did not want him to find out through a medical consultation, through a stranger sitting across a desk from him explaining what was wrong with his wife, while she sat in another room entirely. She wanted to be the one to tell him. She needed to be. Dr. Wren sat with her for a long time that evening. He said again, as he had said several times before, that he believed Edward had the right to know, that keeping this from him was not protection, it was a removal of his choice. That this man had made vows, serious vows, and he had made them without the information he should have had. Isolde listened to all of this. She did not argue. She said, I know all of it. Give me 1 week." He gave her the week. He would say later, to no one in particular, that it was the right decision and the wrong decision at the same time. He would say that for the rest of his life, and he would still not entirely know which word was more accurate. That week was the strangest week Isolde had ever lived through. She knew the conversation was coming. She knew it had to happen. And in the meantime, she had to continue being normal, sitting at breakfast, managing the household, taking her afternoon rest, having dinner with Edward, and talking about the things they usually talked about. But she looked at everything differently that week. She looked at the dining room table and thought about how many mornings she had sat there. She looked at the garden and counted the rose bushes she had not yet learned the names of. She looked at Edward, carefully, honestly, the way she had been afraid to look at him before, and understood, in a way she had been avoiding understanding, how much she was going to miss him. That was the thing she had not let herself think about clearly. She had been so focused on not losing him, on having whatever time she could have, that she had not fully thought through the other side of it, that she was going to leave him, that he was going to be left, that the kindness she had thought she was giving him, saving him from marrying a dying woman, she had instead turned into something harder. She had let him fall into a life, a home, a marriage, and he was going to have it taken away. She lay awake on the 4th night and stared at the ceiling for a very long time. He was asleep. His breathing was quiet and even. She listened to it and felt, for the first time, the full weight of what she had done, not just what she was hiding, but what the hiding itself had cost, what it was still costing, what it was going to cost when it was over. She made herself a promise, there in the dark, listening to him breathe. When she told him she was not going to cry, she was going to be honest and clear, and she was going to give him the truth as plainly as she could, and she was not going to cry, because if she cried she would fall apart, and she needed to hold together long enough to say what needed to be said. She chose a Wednesday evening, after dinner. She asked the staff to clear everything early and not come back, which was unusual enough that the housekeeper, Mrs. Thornley, gave her a slightly worried look. Isolde thanked her and closed the dining room door. But she did not do it in the dining room. She moved to Edward's study, which was smaller, which felt more honest somehow. His own space, his own desk, the bookshelves she had slowly started to know her way around. She sat in one of the chairs across from where he usually sat. She waited. He came in a few minutes later, saw the setup, looked at her face, and closed the door behind him without saying anything. He sat down. He waited. She had prepared what she wanted to say. She had rehearsed it. She started talking and the prepared words fell apart almost immediately, and she had to find the real ones instead. She told him she was ill. She told him how long she had known, which meant she told him she had known before the wedding. She told him why she had not said anything. All of it. The real reasons, not the polished version but the honest one. That she had loved him. That she had been afraid. That she had told herself she was protecting him when what she was really doing was protecting herself from losing something she had not expected to want so much. She put the envelope from Dr. Wren on the table between them. Medical documents, she said. Everything was in there. She told him she was not going to ask him anything from him. She told him she understood that what she had done had taken something from him, his right to choose, and that she was not going to pretend otherwise. She told him she loved him. She used the present tense. She was not going to hide that part either. Then she stopped talking and sat still and waited, and kept her promise to herself about not crying, which was the hardest thing she had ever done. The room was very quiet. Edward did not speak. Not for a long time. He looked at the envelope. He picked it up and held it. He did not open it. He put it back down. He stood up. He went to the window. He put one hand against the window frame and stood there with his back to her for a while, and she could see his shoulders and the tension in them, and she understood that he was doing what he always did. He was holding himself together until he could trust himself to speak. When he turned around, his face looked different than she had ever seen it. It was the face of a person who had just had something very large and very heavy fall on them, and who was not yet sure whether they were destroyed by it or not. There were things moving in his expression that he was not trying to hide, which was new, which told her something. He walked back across the room and sat down in the chair beside her, not across from her, beside her. He picked up both her hands in both of his. He said, "How long have you been carrying this?" She said, "Long enough." He said, "You should have told me." She said, "I know." He was quiet again. "Then I would not have walked away." She looked at him. He said it again, quietly, as if he was telling himself as much as her, as if he was only now saying it out loud, fully understanding that it was true. "I would not have walked away." She did cry, in the end. She had made herself a promise and she broke it. She cried and he kept hold of her hands and did not say anything else for a while, because there was nothing else that needed to be said right then. The truth was in the room now. The worst of it was done. In the days after that conversation, things changed between them in a way that was difficult to describe to anyone who had not been watching. The performance was gone. That careful, well-behaved distance that had characterized the early weeks of the marriage, the two of them being on their best behavior, saying the correct things, maintaining the correct distance, disappeared. What was left was just the two of them as they actually were, in a situation that was as raw and honest as anything either of them had ever been in. Edward told his steward that his schedule was changing. He canceled things. He reorganized things. His steward was a man who had worked for the Ashford estate for 30 years and had seen several dukes in various states of preoccupation. He had never seen this particular duke look the way he looked now. He asked no questions and did everything he was told. Edward moved his afternoon review of the estate accounts to early morning, which was the only time of day he reliably had to himself. He kept the rest of the day open, not because he hovered over Isolde. She found hovering infuriating and told him so on the third day, which was fair enough, but because he wanted to be available. He wanted to be there. That was the most honest he could be about it. He also, very quietly and without telling anyone why, began building a greenhouse off the east wing of the house. The plans were drawn up within a week. He told the head gardener it was for extended season flowers and vegetables. The head gardener accepted this explanation. Edward supervised personally, which he had never done with any construction project before. When it was half finished, Isolde found him there on a Saturday morning with the architect, discussing the height of the glass panels. She looked at the structure taking shape and then at him. He explained that the damp from the lake was particularly bad in winter, that having a warm indoor garden would allow her to be near growing things without the cold air that aggravated her lungs. She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "You built me a garden." He said, "I am building you a greenhouse." She said, "That is what I said." He was absolutely terrible at receiving gratitude. She had noticed this early on. He looked deeply uncomfortable and returned to discussing the glass panels. She went back inside smiling in a way she did not bother to hide, which she also would not have done 3 months ago. With the secret gone, the conversations changed. They were no longer two people navigating carefully around things they could not or would not say. They talked about everything. He told her about Constance. He had not spoken of her, really spoken of her, to anyone. He told Isolde about the early days of that marriage, which had been pleasant and quiet. He told her about the fever, how quick it had been, how he had still been writing to her family to arrange a visit when she died. He told her that the worst part, the part he had never admitted out loud, was that he had not known how to grieve someone he had never fully known. That the marriage had been a good arrangement, and he had been fond of Constance, genuinely fond of her, but that he had kept too much distance, too much of the proper correct space between a man and his wife, and when she was gone, he had nothing to hold on to except a sense of having missed something important without knowing exactly when it had gone. Isolde listened to all of this without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "You were not a bad husband. You were a man who did not know how to be less than perfectly composed, and nobody told you that was the problem." He thought about that for a long time. She told him about her childhood, the house that had slowly emptied of things as her father's finances deteriorated, the way the family had maintained every appearance of normality even as the reality underneath became very different. She told him what it was like to know from a very young age that her value to her family was partly measured in her marriageability, that she had made peace with this, or thought she had, and had then been caught completely off guard by how much she had not wanted to be a transaction when it was actually happening. He said, "You were never a transaction to me, not after the first dinner." She said, "I know that now." They argued. Not in the careful, formal way of the courtship, but actually argued about things that mattered to them, about the responsibilities of people with wealth and title, about whether hope was a virtue or a lie you told yourself, about God, which was a very long argument that neither of them won, about whether the ending of a certain novel was right or wrong, which was the longest argument of all and the most enjoyable. She taught him 2 card games she had learned from the kitchen staff as a girl, games that were not at all aristocratic, and that Edward had absolutely no prior knowledge of. He beat her at both of them within the week. She accused him of cheating. He said nothing in his defense, which she later decided was more or less a confession. He read to her in the evenings when she was tired. He chose books she had mentioned wanting to read, but had not got around to. His reading voice was unexpectedly good, clear and measured, with enough variation to make the characters distinct. She fell asleep to the sound of it more than once. He always kept reading until he was sure she was properly asleep before he put the book down. Isolde's mother arrived in November. She came on a Tuesday and was shown to the green guest room, which was the nicest of the guest rooms, and was given tea and a chance to settle before anyone asked anything of her. Her first meeting with Edward after the truth was known was something that both of them had been dreading in their own ways, and both of them had prepared for it differently. Lady Marin had prepared an apology, a long, carefully thought-out explanation of why she had agreed to Isolde's decision, and what she had been thinking, and how she knew it had been wrong, and how deeply she regretted it. Edward had not prepared anything in particular. He sat down across from her in the library and looked at this woman, who had watched her daughter walk down an aisle toward him, knowing what she knew, and he took a breath, and he said something that Lady Marin had not expected. He said, "I don't blame you." Lady Marin blinked. He said, "It was an impossible position, and you did what your daughter asked you to do. I am not going to make you feel it again. We are both going to need to be here for her, and we cannot do that if we are sitting across from each other with this between us." She cried. He had expected this. He stood, said he would give her a few minutes, and left the room. He came back with tea, which was the Ashford household solution to most things, and by the time he returned, she had composed herself. Lady Maren stayed for 6 weeks. She and Edward developed a respect for each other that was not quite friendship, but was something real. She was a sharp woman, sharper than people assumed, and she and Edward could spend an entire dinner in a kind of quiet, tactical conversation about how to manage Isolde, how to offer help without making her feel managed, how to give her independence while keeping an eye on things. They were good at it together. Better, honestly, than either of them would have been alone. Isolde knew exactly what they were doing and let them do it, because she could see that doing it together was good for both of them, and because she was pragmatic enough to appreciate that being well managed by people who loved her was not actually the worst thing that could happen. There were good days. This is the part of the story that matters as much as any of the hard parts. There were days when Isolde woke up and felt like herself, like the person she had been before any of this, full of energy and sharp and curious about everything. Days when she and Edward took the horses out early in the morning, before the rest of the estate woke up, and rode out over the fields with the frost still on the ground and their breath visible in the cold air. Days when she was in the greenhouse for hours, repotting and pruning and directing things, coming back into the house with her hands dirty, and a contentment about her that Edward found himself watching with something close to awe. There was a Christmas that first year that was quiet by most standards but felt full. Her mother was there, and Dr. Wren came for 2 days, and a few of Edward's closer friends visited. Nobody talked about the illness. They ate too much, played cards badly, argued about a game of charades that Isolde insisted she had won and no one else agreed with. And Edward laughed more in those 3 days than he could remember laughing in the previous 3 years combined. There was an afternoon in late January that Isolde would call, when she talked about it, simply the good afternoon. She had woken feeling well, genuinely well, unexpectedly well, and by the time Edward came down for breakfast, she was already in the greenhouse and already laughing at something Thomas, the head gardener, had said. Edward came through the glass door and stood there watching her without her seeing him. She had mud on her hands, and her hair was doing something it was not supposed to do in the wind, and she was arguing with Thomas about where the orchids should go, and she was laughing. He stood in the doorway and watched her for long enough that Thomas noticed him standing there before she did, and gave him a look of such understanding and sadness and human recognition that Edward had to look away for a moment. When she finally saw him, she said, "You are lurking." He said, "I am standing in a doorway." She said, "That is what lurking is." He came in and helped with the orchids, which he knew nothing about, which she cheerfully exploited by giving him the worst jobs, the heavy lifting, the moving of the big pots. He did all of it without complaint, which she appreciated and did not say so, and which he knew she appreciated, and they spent 2 hours in that greenhouse together on that January afternoon that were, without either of them needing to say it, among the best 2 hours of both of their lives. Spring came and the good days became less frequent. Not gone. They still came, and when they came they were still real and valuable, and she and Edward both treated them as exactly that. But the mornings became harder, then the afternoons. There were days she stayed in bed, which she resented, which she was sometimes able to hide, and sometimes not. Edward never made her feel like an invalid. This was the thing she needed from him more than anything, and the thing he somehow understood, perhaps because of Constance, perhaps just because he knew her well enough by now. He did not tiptoe. He did not whisper when he came into the room. He sat beside her and talked to her the same way he always had, honestly, directly, with the same edge of dry wit that she had come to recognize as his version of affection. He treated her like herself. On the days when that was the only thing holding her together, it held her. Dr. Wren came more frequently as the months progressed. He and Edward had a relationship now that was complicated, built on the initial wrong of what had been hidden and then rebuilt, slowly, into something functional and respectful. Edward never entirely let go of his feelings about the letter and what it had contained. But Dr. Wren was good at what he did, and he was devoted to Isolde in the way of someone who had known her all her life, and Edward valued that. You can value something and still have complicated feelings about the person who provides it. Edward was a man who had learned, in recent months, to hold complicated feelings without having to resolve them. Isolde began writing letters in the spring. She did not make a production of it. She sat at her small desk in the bedroom in the mornings and wrote, and did not explain what she was writing, and Edward did not ask. He understood what the letters were. He left her to it. She wrote one for every member of the household staff. She wrote one for Thomas, the head gardener, about the orchids and what they needed, and how he should take credit for them after she was gone. She wrote one for her father, which was the hardest to write and the shortest. She wrote one for her mother, which was very long and which she cried through and rewrote twice. She wrote one for Edward. It took her 3 weeks. She sealed it and gave it to Mrs. Thornley with instructions that it was to be given to the Duke 10 days after she died, not before. In the later weeks, when it became clear that they were counting days rather than months, Isolde asked Edward one thing. She asked him to move his sleeping arrangements into the same room. They had, since the early weeks of the marriage, each kept their own room in the traditional manner of the period. It had never felt cold to either of them. They moved between the rooms freely, and it was simply how things had always been. But now, she said, she wanted to hear him in the room at night. She was not frightened of dying, she said. She just slept better when she could hear him. He said, of course. He slept in a chair. There was a proper chair available, a large armchair, and he had it moved from the sitting room into the bedroom. She looked at the chair and then at him, and said he was being ridiculous. He said he found the chair perfectly adequate. She said he would ruin his back. He said his back had survived considerably worse in the army. She said that was a different kind of damage, and he knew it. He said, go to sleep. She said, you are impossible. She was asleep within 20 minutes. He adjusted the pillow behind his back, opened the book he had brought with him, and read until the candle burnt low. Then he sat in the dark for a while, listening to her breathe. She died on a Tuesday morning in August, 14 months after the wedding. It was a quiet morning, the kind England has sometimes in August, when the summer has finally settled down and everything is very still. The windows were open, and the garden smelled of the roses that Thomas had planted along the east wall, the ones Isolde had chosen herself from the catalogue in March. Edward was beside her. Her mother was holding her hand. Dr. Wren was in the hallway because that was where he needed to be, close enough to be there, and far enough to give them the room. She had not been awake much in the preceding days, but that morning she had opened her eyes and been present in a way she had not been for a while, and she and Edward had spoken, not for long, not very much, the way you speak at the end of something, when the important words have already been said, and what remains is just being there. She said at one point, very quietly, the orchids are going to need repotting in September. He said, I know. Thomas has the instructions. She said, good. Those were the last words she said to him. He would think about them a great deal afterward. He would decide, eventually, that they were exactly right. Nothing unchosen. Nothing performed. Just her, taking care of things she cared about. To the end. The household did not speak above a murmur for 3 days. The staff moved quietly. Mrs. Thornley, who had run that house for 12 years without any visible display of personal feeling, was found crying in the linen room on the first afternoon. No one mentioned it. The estate, in its way, grieved. 10 days after the funeral, Mrs. Thornley brought the letter to Edward in the study. She placed it on his desk and withdrew without saying anything. He sat with it for a long time before opening it. The letter was long. He read it once through without stopping, and then he put it down and sat very still for a while. Then he picked it up and read it again. No one ever knew what was in that letter. He did not speak of it. In later years, when people who knew him well tried to understand the man he became after her death, quieter in some ways, but also warmer, more willing to simply sit with people, less restless in the way of a man who always needs to be doing something, there was no single explanation they could agree on. Some pointed to the grief itself, some pointed to the marriage, a few pointed to the letter. The letter survived him. After his death, it was found with his other private papers, still in the original envelope, worn at the folds from being opened and refolded many times. His executors left it sealed. Edward Harlow, the 8th Duke of Ashford, did not remarry. He served out the remainder of his parliamentary term. He managed his estate. He spent more time in the greenhouse than any previous Duke of Ashford had spent in any garden on record. Thomas, the head gardener, who stayed at the estate until his own retirement, said later that the Duke had become genuinely good with orchids, which he offered as his highest form of praise. He was known in his later years as someone who was easy to talk to, which, to anyone who had known him in his 30s, was a remarkable sentence. He had a reputation for listening carefully, for saying honest things without cruelty, for not wasting words. People came to him with difficult problems and left feeling, not that he had solved anything necessarily, but that they had been genuinely heard. He seemed to understand that this was sometimes more valuable. He talked about Isolde. Over the years, in the way people talk about someone they have absorbed into the way they see the world. Not constantly, not performatively, but sometimes, in conversation, something would surface, an observation, a way of looking at a problem, a specific kind of patience, that those who had known him before and after could trace back to her. He visited Lady Marin every year until she died, which she did at the age of 76, having outlived her husband and her daughter, and holding herself together through sheer will and a great deal of strong tea. Edward sat with her at the end the same way he had sat with Isolde, not hovering, not performing grief in advance, but simply being there. She told him, near the very end, that she was sorry again, still, about the letter, about the secret. He took her hand and told her what he had told her all those years ago in the library. That he understood why it had happened, that it was done, that she should rest. He died at 71. He had been unwell for several months, which he managed in his characteristic way, quietly, without drama, arranging things carefully so that others would not be inconvenienced. He was found in his study on a Saturday morning, in the chair behind his desk, with a book open beside him and a letter on the desk that his staff recognized by the envelope. It was Isolde's letter, the one from the desk. It had been with him in the study that day, as it had been many days. There is one person in this story who is easy to overlook, and that is Dr. Percival Wren. He was the man who stood in the hallway, the man who sat in the third pew, the man who kept a secret he did not want to keep, and then spent the rest of his life quietly carrying the weight of having kept it. He had known Isolde since she was 4 years old. He had treated her for childhood fevers, for a broken wrist she got from falling out of a tree, for the flu that went through the Cavendish household 3 winters in a row and always seemed to hit Isolde the hardest. He knew her the way doctors know patients they have cared for a long time, not just as a body with symptoms, but as a person, a whole specific person, with a personality and habits and ways of being in the world that you cannot help but learn over 2 decades of care. When he sat across from her in that sitting room and told her the truth, and then watched her absorb it and ask only 2 questions and then compose herself and thank him, he felt something that was not quite admiration and not quite grief, but somewhere between the two. He had delivered difficult news many times in his career. He had never seen anyone receive it the way Isolde did. He disagreed with her decision not to tell Edward. He said so, more than once. He came back to it over the months that followed, as the weight of the secret grew, as the wedding happened, and then the first weeks of the marriage, and then the collapse in the garden. Every time something happened that made it worse, he felt it, not as guilt exactly, because he had not made this choice, but as a kind of complicity. He was inside the secret whether he liked it or not. When she finally told Edward, and Dr. Wren learned that it had happened, Isolde told him herself, the next day, in the library, and she looked lighter than she had looked in months. He felt something that surprised him. Not relief, though there was some of that. What he felt mostly was a profound gratitude that it was done, that the two of them now knew each other as they actually were, that the thing he had been watching from the outside, the odd and careful tenderness of their early marriage, had now been given the chance to become real. He had worried, before, that Edward would react badly, that the honor and the pride and the controlled nature of the man would make him hard rather than soft, that he would feel deceived in a way that closed him off. Dr. Wren had seen people respond to loss in that way, shutting down, hardening, going through the motions. He had been afraid that is what Edward would do. He was wrong. He was glad to be wrong. He told Isolde so, on one of his visits in the winter, when she was having a good week, and they were sitting in the greenhouse, and she was explaining her system for the orchids, with the particular enthusiasm she always brought to things she cared about. He said, "I did not know if he had it in him." She said, "I did." She said it quietly, with the certainty of someone who had thought about it and decided. He believed her. Dr. Wren attended the funeral. He stood at the back. Afterward, Edward came and found him. Not to say anything complicated, just to shake his hand and hold it for a moment, which was the Ashford version of an embrace, and which Dr. Wren understood and appreciated. They did not become friends, exactly, but they had shared something too serious to be strangers, and the respect between them was genuine. Dr. Wren retired 3 years after Isolde died. He went to live with his sister on the coast, and took long walks every morning. He kept Isolde's letter. She had written one for him, a short one, which he had not expected. He read it rarely, but he kept it. People who knew him in his later years said he was the kind of doctor that patients trusted absolutely, that he had a particular skill for sitting with people in difficult moments without making it worse. He would have said, if asked, that he had learned most of what he knew about how to do that from watching Isolde Harlow, from watching the way she faced the hardest thing with both hands open. It is worth spending a moment on the household, because no story about people like this happens in a vacuum. There were always other people in the room, or just outside it, people whose names history does not record, but whose presence shaped everything. Mrs. Thornley had run Ashford Estate for 12 years before Isolde arrived. She was a compact, efficient woman in her late 40s who believed that a well-run house was the foundation of a well-lived life, and that the Duke before Isolde had been a perfectly adequate employer but a somewhat empty one. A house with only one person in it, and that person given to long silences and irregular hours, was a house that could not quite breathe properly. Isolde changed that. Within 3 weeks of her arrival, she had learned everyone's name, their years of service, and at least one personal fact about each of them, something that she had found out by simply paying attention, which was Isolde's primary method for everything. Mrs. Thornley noticed this. She also noticed that the Duke, who had previously been perfectly polite, but somewhat invisible to his own household, had begun to know these things too. He started using names. He started asking about the cook's daughter's new apprenticeship, about whether the second footman's knee was improving, about how Mrs. Thornley's sister in Devon was getting on. He had learned these things from Isolde. Whether he knew that or not, Mrs. Thornley could not say, but the household felt it, and the household responded. There was a warmth to the estate in those 14 months that old members of the staff would describe, decades later, as the best time they could remember working there. Hannah, the housemaid who had found Isolde in the rose garden, was 17 years old and had been working at Ashford for just under a year. She had been frightened when she found her, and she had run as fast as she had ever run in her life to find the Duke, and she had watched from the doorway as he knelt in the gravel next to his wife, and the gravel pressed into his good trousers, and he did not care at all. She thought about that image for the rest of her life, not because it was dramatic, but because of what it meant, that this man, who was so correct in every public situation, had knelt in the gravel without hesitating. After Isolde died, Hannah was the one who kept the greenhouse. The Duke had asked Mrs. Thornley who would do it, and Mrs. Thornley had said Hannah, because Hannah had spent enough time in there with Lady Isolde to know what things needed and how she had liked them kept. Edward had agreed. Hannah kept it for the remaining years of his life, and the orchids survived, which Isolde would have considered the important measure of success. People, when they hear this story, sometimes ask what the lesson is. What are we supposed to take from it? Whether Isolde was wrong to hide the truth, or whether Edward was wrong to have been the kind of man that made hiding it seem necessary, or whether the real lesson is about time, or love, or both. The honest answer is probably that there is no single lesson. Life, when it is real and not summarized, tends to resist those. What you can say is this: two people who were both, in different ways, keeping themselves behind walls, found each other in circumstances so forced and so honestly terrible that the walls simply stopped being possible, and what happened between them when the walls came down turned out to be realer than most people get to experience in a full lifetime. Isolde was afraid. The fear was human. The decision she made from it was flawed. And the love that drove the decision, the same love that made her so afraid to lose him that she chose silence over honesty, that love was completely real. It is possible for something to be both flawed and real at exactly the same time. Most of the important things in life are. Edward was a man who had never learned to be anything other than composed and correct, and who was given, in the space of 14 months, the complete and undeniable evidence that composition and correctness were not, by themselves, a life. He learned to be present. He learned to be warm. He learned to hold someone's hand when there was nothing practical to do. He was 71 years old when he died, and the people who knew him in those later years had a hard time believing the descriptions of the stiff, unreachable man of his earlier decades. But that man had existed. He had just been, eventually, broken open, not destroyed by it, but changed. He kept her letter for 33 years. There is one more thing worth saying before this story closes. Something about the way people sometimes talk about stories like this one, using words like tragic, or beautiful, or heartbreaking. And it is all of those things. But it is also very ordinary, in the best possible sense of that word. Not every love story involves a duke and an estate and the kind of tragedy that keeps a letter worn at the folds for 33 years. But the underneath of it, two people finding each other late, finding each other imperfectly, finding each other in the middle of circumstances that should have made it impossible, that is not unusual. That happens. It has always happened. What makes this one worth telling is not the grandeur of it, it is the humanness of it. The specific, stubborn, difficult, tender humanness of two people who somehow got it right, even when everything around them was going wrong. Isolde, in one of her letters, not the one to Edward, but the one to her mother, wrote something that her mother repeated once, in her later years, to someone she trusted. She said that she had been afraid, for a long time, that love was something she might run out of time to properly learn, that she had felt it, understood it in theory, but that the actual practice of it, the full, open, unprotected version of it, had always seemed like something for later, when the circumstances were better, when she was less afraid. She wrote that she was glad, in the end, that she had been forced into the present tense, that the circumstances had never been better, and she had loved him anyway, and that it had been enough. More than enough. Everything. Edward never read that letter. It was not addressed to him. But if he had read it, and if anyone had been watching his face when he did, they would have seen something move through his expression that was too private to name. Because she had said, in those words, exactly what he would have said too, if he had ever known how to say it. Think about where they both started. Edward, a man so contained he had watched his first wife die without knowing how to hold on to her. Isolde, a woman so afraid of losing something that she had been willing to risk everything, including the honesty that was the only real foundation anything between them could ever be built on. Two people with walls so high that under normal circumstances the walls might have stayed up forever. They could have had a quiet, respectable, pleasant marriage. They could have been polite to each other their whole lives and called it enough. But the circumstances were not normal. And the walls came down. Not all at once, gradually, through the notes on the desk and the books chosen carefully, and the laughter at the end of the second dance, and the night she told him, and the moment he sat beside her, instead of across from her, and took her hands. Gradually, the walls came down, and what was underneath was two people who were, it turned out, exactly what each other needed. Not perfectly, not easily, but really. 33 years. That is how long he kept her letter. 33 years of reading it, and folding it, and placing it back in the envelope, and going back to his life, and then reaching for it again. There is a mathematics to grief that nobody talks about clearly, the way it does not diminish as time passes so much as it changes shape. It becomes less sharp and more wide. It becomes less about the loss and more about the presence. Less I lost her and more she was here. And the difference between those two things, for Edward, was the difference between a wound and a foundation. He had been changed by her, permanently, thoroughly changed. And the letter, worn at the folds, was the record of that. Not of her death, but of her life, of what she had been, of what she had made of him. When the title does not matter, when the money does not matter, when the correct thing to do and the proper way to behave and all the rules and arrangements that govern how people like this are supposed to live, when all of that becomes irrelevant, because the only thing that is real is the person in the room with you. That is what happened in that study, on a Wednesday evening, when a woman sat across from a man and told him the truth she had been carrying since before she married him, and that is what continued to happen, every day after, for the 14 months they had. It was not what either of them had planned. It was not what anyone would have chosen. But it was real, and it lasted, and in the end, perhaps, that is all any of it is ever supposed to do.